Greetings, Tenno. Today I'd like to cover everything you need to know about the circuit. But before we talk about what the circuit is, let's go over how to get there. To get to the circuit, you'll have to complete the Duviri Paradox quest, which means you'll have to get to the Uranus Junction. After you finish the quest, you'll have an icon in your navigation menu that takes you directly to Duviri. To get to the circuit, you're going to have to do at least one run of the Duviri experience and the lone story. Once you get to Steel Path, you're going to have to do them again to unlock the Steel Path circuit. Before we get into the details of the circuit, I feel compelled to weigh in on the debate of should you do the New War or the Duviri Paradox first. In my opinion, it doesn't really matter from a story perspective. When you do the Duviri Paradox, you're going to be confused as hell for most of it, whether you've done the New War or not. From a practicality standpoint, I recommend doing Duviri first, because it's going to give you access to a lot of Warframes that can be a real pain in the ass to farm normally. In my opinion, by the time you get through the New War, you're basically already done with the star chart, and then you'll be heading to Steel Path and wanting to do the Steel Path circuit for Incarnate Adapters instead. For what it's worth, I did Duviri first, and it made the end of the New War better for me, but it probably made the kind of beginning middle section a little bit worse. When I was new, I was nervous going into the circuit, so if you feel the same way, this section's going to be for you. The circuit is a roguelite mode where you choose from randomized warframes and weapons, and you do missions back to back until you either finish or you've had enough and leave. Between each mission, you're going to have the opportunity to leave or continue, and your progress is going to be saved. So if you do 5 missions back to back, then fail the 6th mission, the progress for the first 5 are still going to count. The between mission screen is going to show how many rounds you've completed, which reward node you've made it to, and which mission type is next. Enemy levels will increase each round, and you'll get the same decrees that you got from the Duviri experience or the lone story. At the time of this recording, there are 7 mission types in the circuit, all derivatives of their star chart counterpart. I'll go into a little detail since, depending where you are on the star chart, you may not have seen a couple of these yet. This is the exact same as it is on the star chart, except it's only 3 rounds instead of 5. This is also the exact same as the star chart. You only have to go for 5 minutes, and there's no way to extend it. You're just going to continue to the next mission type. Everybody's favorite. This is the same as it is everywhere else, except you only have to get 300 cryotic instead of 500. This has the same issue as the star chart excavations, in that enemies are just going to randomly stop carrying the charge cells, and you just have to kind of wait it out. For best practice, stay on one excavator unless you're splitting off into groups of 2 and you're completely capable of locking down the entire area without your full team. As a tip, you can also pick up a canister with your Warframe, then swap to your operator or drifter and pick up a second one, which will allow you to carry 2 of them instead of 1 if you're far away from the excavator. This is the same as any other exterminate, except Corrupted Vor is going to spawn and he has to be killed to complete it. Unlike in the Void, he won't drop a mod, but he will always drop a rune marrow. The first mission you might not have seen yet. There will be orbs littered all over the place. Just jump through them until you've filled the little container that's following you around. Then you stand near the arches to close them. You'll need to close 5 gates to finish. Killing enemies in this mode is a waste of time. Ignore them as much as possible and just worry about grabbing the orbs. As a tip, you can use your operator or drifter to void sling up to the orbs in high places, or to grab the giant orb that'll be floating around the area. This is the jackal fight you did at the very beginning of the game, but with a little twist. You still attack the legs to weaken it. It still does the laser grid, except this time there are actually objects to hide behind. You still hit him with your Parazon. but after he teleports, you'll have to kill all the enemies in the area before it's vulnerable again. This is the most bugged mission for me and generally has a problem every single time. So common issues include the Jackal freezing, the Jackal going for 4 to 6 rotations instead of 3, Jackal going into his Parazon phase so high in the air that you can't reach him, Jackal being inexplicably invulnerable. If you're thinking it might be time for you to leave the circuit and this is the next mission in the lineup, you might be better off just leaving. This is the other mission you may not have played yet. You'll be given a combined element to create, which will be displayed on the left side of your screen. When you kill enemies, they're going to drop an element amphor, pick it up, and throw it at the crucible. Once it's filled up, you'll move to the next crucible, which may or may not be a different element. Just like excavation, you can use your operator or drifter to carry a second amphor, and you'll need to complete 2 elements to move on. You can view which Warframes and weapons will be available directly from the Duviri screen in your navigation menu. It's best to know what you're going to be playing before you queue up for the circuit if you're going to be playing on public matchmaking. Sometimes you'll load in and the rest of the team is just run through the gate, which is then going to pull you in. Sometimes you'll just be matched with dickheads who aren't going to give you time to decide what to pick and are going to run through the gate while you're still looking. Having an idea of what you're going to play is going to make it a lot smoother when you get in there. You should start every mission by trying to find the decree fragments. There are 3 of them per mission, and collecting all 3 is going to give you another decree. The decrees are the difference between lasting 4 rounds in the circuit or lasting 12, and this is even more important in defense missions. Find the decree fragment before you start the defense. Once it starts, you may not have a chance to go look for them. In the normal, not steel path circuit, the decrees are going to carry your weapons pretty hard. You can try new Warframes, you can try new weapons that you don't own, because the base builds combined with the decrees are going to make anything good. In steel path, this isn't the case anymore. You need to have your own builds for the weapons by then. I used the normal circuit to find Warframes and weapons that I wanted to farm for later. On the other hand, any builds that you have on your weapons and Warframes will carry over into the circuit. So if you have something built up, you can use it instead of the basic builds that the game provides. As an example, here you can see that I didn't own most of the weapons, and the ones that I do own aren't any good. If I were doing this on normal, I could have just used the decrees to build up these weapons. But since I'm in Steel Path, I chose Protea as my Warframe because she doesn't need any weapons. In a similar vein, I recommend not using exalted weapons in the circuits if you're using the default builds. I have a strong suspicion that the weapons have blank builds on them and they're just completely useless even in non-Steel Path. Collect your rewards. You don't actually receive the stage rewards from the circuit until you go back into it. If you still haven't collected them by Sunday's reset, you lose them, I think. I've never actually not collected them, so I don't know if they'd stay or not. The more missions you do in a row, the more XP you'll get, all the way up to stage 5. If you can, try to stay until at least stage 5 to get the maximum amount of XP, but if you're really struggling, feel free to leave whenever you need to. My final tip is to play on public matchmaking or with a squad. I made the mistake of doing the normal circuit solo every week, and all it did was make it take longer than it needed to. When you first start the Steel Path circuit, you're going to need to play with other players or else you're going to get stomped right into the ground. So get used to it now while it's easier. For the normal circuit, you start off by picking one of 3 Warframes. These are on a set rotation and you can see which week it is by checking the wiki. After you pick your Warframe, you'll see the progress screen. On the 2nd, 5th, 8th, and 10th tier, you're going to get your Warframe blueprints. On the 7th tier, you'll always have an augment mod for your Warframe. And for the rest of the tiers, you can get Warframe arcanes, mods, endo, credits, or weapon blueprints. For the Steel Path circuit, you actually get 2 choices per week. You can choose from Incarnate Adapters, Rivens, or 20,000 Kuva. You'll get your rewards on Tier 5 and 10, and in between can be Duviri Arcanes, Kuva, Endo, Riven Slivers, Exilus Adapter Blueprints, Rivens, Boosters, and Formal Blueprints. At Tier 9, it's always going to be 25 Steel Essence. I'm not going to give Incarnate recommendations for a few reasons. It's beyond the scope of this video, which is more catered towards those who are going to do the normal circuit to get Warframes. There are already dozens of videos from people more qualified than I am giving Incarnate recommendations. And I haven't unlocked all of the Incarnates yet. Mostly because I haven't bothered to farm the Pathos clamps for them. But still, I don't feel comfortable giving recommendations when I haven't used all of them. What I don't see people talking about, however, are which frames to get from the normal circuit. So let's go through them week by week. Excalibur is a starter frame. Even if you didn't start with him, you can get him from Lieutenant Lech Krill on War on Mars. Very easy boss fight, even for a new player. Trinity comes from the Ambulus boss fight on Pluto. That fight is actually a bit of a pain in the ass. However, Ember comes from General Sargus Ruck on Tethys Saturn. That fight is also a pain in the ass, and I feel like Ember is probably more fun for a newer player. Trinity is definitely viable, but I don't think that a new player is going to find her very fun, to be honest. So I would give the nod this week to Ember. Loki comes from the Hyena Pack boss fight on Samanth Neptune. Also a very easy fight. You probably won't even realize how you killed them all. Mag is also a starter frame, and if you didn't pick her as your starter, she comes from the Sergeant on Iliad on Phobos, which is the easiest, most joke of a boss fight in the entire game. Rhino comes from the Jackal on Fossa and Venus, and to be honest, you probably already have Rhino. He was probably the first frame that you farmed. And if not, you probably already have all of the blueprints for him. So the nod this week would go to Loki, although, to be honest, all of these are really easy. You could just skip this week if you wanted to. Ash comes from Railjack, which instantly makes him a pain in the ass to farm in the winter of this week before I even get into the other ones. Frost comes from the Captain Vor and Lieutenant Lech Krill fight on Exta in Ceres. Even though there's technically 2 bosses there, they're both pushovers. It's a very easy fight. Nyx comes from the Forid assassination missions that only appear during infested invasions. This actually makes her more tedious to farm than difficult. The fight isn't hard. You're almost always going to be able to matchmake into a squad to fight it, and somebody's going to one-shot it. Really, it's just waiting for the missions to pop up for you to be able to do them. So again, for this week, Ash, total pain in the ass to farm normally. Saren comes from the Keladithame fight on Marrow on Sedna. This fight isn't necessarily difficult so much as it is a pain to get into, because in order to fight her in the first place, you have to go through a bunch of arena fights to earn the opportunity to fight her. Way easier to just farm Saren out of the circuit, and also keep this in mind later for another Warframe. Valbin comes from the Nightwave. I do actually recommend that you farm Valbin from the circuit instead of using all of your Nightwave credits to get him. Those are better spent towards Potatoes and Nightane. However, I do feel like Saren is probably the better choice for the first time you do this, unless you just really think Valbin looks fun. Nova comes from the Raptors on Nama on Europa. Very early game, very easy. Don't waste your energy farming her in the circuit. It's probably faster to just farm her from the mission. Necros comes from the Lephantis boss fight on Magnusinium Deimos. This fight can be a bit of a struggle for a new player, but if you go on public, it's generally pretty easy. Somebody will one-shot it for you. Valkyr you get from Alid V on Themisto Jupiter, also a very easy boss fight. Oberon you farm from Railjack, which automatically makes him this week's winner, because once again, that's a huge pain in the ass. I even like doing Railjack, but what you have to do to get Ash and Oberon is a giant pain in the ass for 2 Warframes that aren't worth all the hassle. Hydroid you get from Counselor Vahek on Oro on Earth. This fight isn't that bad. It's more tedious than it is hard. Mirage, you get all of her parts from the Hidden Messages quest. Limbo, you get all of his parts from the Limbo Theorem quest. So for this week, if you're not going to skip it because they're all easy, I would say get Hydroid, just because the other 2, you actually get every one of their blueprints from the quest that you go through to get them in the first place. Mesa is from the Mutalist Alid V assassination outside of Eris. As you can see, I haven't even done that mission. It's not required for Steel Path. Everything you have to do to get to that fight is a pain in the ass. You have to go through invasions to get the Mutalist Alid V nav coordinate. Then you have to build it in your foundry. Then you have to go do the fight, and you have to do that over and over and over again until you get all of the parts. As you can tell, she's the one that's going to win this week. Chroma is our first trap frame. So you actually get all of Chroma's blueprints through the junctions to get to other planets. And you also get his main blueprint through the New Strange, I believe, quest. However, the reason Chroma is a trap is, aside from that you're already going to get all of his blueprints just going through the Star Chart junctions, he requires other Warframes to build his parts. Those Warframes include Volt, who you can just get from the dojo, Ember, who was one of our picks for the circuit because she's a little bit more of a pain to get, Frost, who's not too bad, and if you remember what I said for week 4, one of the parts you need to build Chroma is Saren. I would skip him entirely. He's not even that good of a Warframe. Atlas you get from the Jordis Golem assassination on Eris. This fight is more tedious than it is difficult. It's not hard at all. I didn't even have a built-up arc wing or arc gun to do it. But it's long, it takes forever, and is boring, all for a frame that's not very good. So, for this week, I would definitely pick Mesa. She's the best frame out of the 3, and the hardest to get. For those of you that saw my last video, you already know what I'm going to say here, but Ivara comes from Spy Vaults. Absolute pain to get, because the best frame, in my opinion, to learn Spy Vaults with is Ivara, but you only get her from doing Spy Vaults, which is why I recommend you get her from the circuit instead. Inaros, you get from the Sands of Inaros quest that you can get from Barrow Katir when he's here. This quest isn't hard, and I thought it was kind of fun. I will give you a small little spoiler here. Bring a stealth frame and your codex scanner with you on this quest. You will thank me later. Titania you get from the Silver Grove quest. You get all of her parts from the quest, and you're going to want to do this quest anyway because there are mods, including the Growing Power Aura and the Brief Respite Aura, that you get from the apothecs that you crafted for this quest. Also, the hardest part of getting Titania isn't doing this quest. The hardest part is getting all the ingredients to make the apothecs. So I still recommend doing her quest so you can get the mods. And for this week, I would definitely say Ivara's the winner. Nidus comes from Rotation C of infested salvage missions on Oestris and Eris. Just pick Nidus this week. Don't do that to yourself. Octavia is a very light trap. The reason I say she's a very light trap is that you'll get the blueprints for her, but you won't get the blueprint for her Manticord, which is still required to buy her, so you have to do her quest anyway. That said, I still recommend getting Octavia out of the circuit rather than the main way, because... Alright, let me go over this. The chassis comes from the music puzzle on Lua. It's not that difficult to actually do once you know how to do it, but it is RNG on if you're going to find it. The Neuroptics is rewarded from rotation C of a theorem survival on Deimos. That means you got to spend 20 minutes in there. The systems come from the A rotation of caches on a planet that's a spoiler, so I'm not going to go into it. Doing caches sucks. Just farm her from the circuit. But you still have to do a quest to get the Manticord. Harrow is a mixed bag to get normally. His main blueprint comes from the Chains of Harrow quest. Chassis, you probably already have 150,000 of them in your inventory because they come from Void Fissures. The Neuroptics come from a Rotation A spy vault on another spoiler planet. And the Systems blueprint is rewarded from defection missions in rotations B and C. And that is... defection is just the worst. Like everything I said about Octavia... You know, I'd fight the Jordas Golem again before I would have to do another defection. Defection sucks. So this week, honestly, pick whichever one you like the most because all three of these suck. Their farm sucks. Both Gara and Revenant come from bounties in the plains, plus their respective quest for the main blueprint. It's actually harder for a new player to farm the materials to build them than it is to actually get their blueprints off of bounties. Korra, on the other hand, comes from the regular, not elite, Sanctuary Onslaught. Nobody wants to do regular Sanctuary Onslaught. You do ESO to level up your weapons, and you never go into regular Sanctuary Onslaught again. Korra is by far the best pick this week. And also, when you do the Sands of Inaros quest, the reason that I told you to use a stealth frame is because in one of those missions, there's going to be a room with like 50 Kavats inside of it, and you're going to need a mountain of Kavat genetic codes to build Korra. If you know that in advance, and you bring a stealth frame and your codex scanner to the Sands of Inaros quest, you're going to be set up to build Korra without all the struggle. The final week is the hardest of trap weeks for new players. Skip this week entirely, but let's go over it. You get both Garuda and Baruch blueprints from Fortuna bounties. The bounties rotate which one that they're going to have featured at the moment, which is a bit of a pain. Hildren comes from the Exploiter Orb boss fight, as well as standing for a hidden syndicate that you may or may not have unlocked yet. The reason I say all three of these are a trap is because all three of these Warframes require toroids to build. And the problem is, toroids are a nightmare to farm, especially if you're new. Although you know who's really good at it? Ibarra. Hildren requires a special toroid that only comes from the Exploiter Orb. So while you're farming those toroids, you might as well get her blueprints too from him instead of wasting your time in the circuit. Garuda and Baruch both require an assortment of toroids, which are also toroids that you're going to need to build your amps, so you're going to have to farm them eventually. But if you already farmed toroids, odds are you've already done enough Fortuna bounties to have most of the blueprints for Garuda and Baruch anyway. I say skip this week entirely. This week is awful for a newer player. Here's a screenshotable cheat sheet that I showed in my last video, just in case you want it for a reference. Hopefully this helped make a decision about which frames to farm, and also helped ease any nerves you had about going into the circuit. I honestly believe it's the best way to farm some of these frames, and you'll be doing yourself a huge disservice by avoiding it.